All right, welcome back to the channel. So, hey, man, it's back to Gary Russell Jr. trying to get in the chest of Javonte Davis to get a fight. This time, he really goes off on both Javonte Davis and Floyd Mayweather Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. Gary Russell Jr. goes in on Gervonta Davis and Floyd Mayweather Jr. again in an attempt to try to get a fight with them. It seems like almost a hopeless, wish for Gary Russell Jr. But hey, man, I commend him on the efforts, and as a result, man, I'm gonna make the videos talking about it as well. And but before I get into the meat of the video, though, hey, if you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel, like the channel, like the video, share the video. It goes towards growing the channel, and it'd be greatly appreciated. Look, Gary Russell Jr. really does deserve a fight with Gervonta Davis, and this is a fight that really should be made. I've been more and more on the chest of Gervonta Davis and Floyd Mayweather Jr. about fighting black fighters, about hopefully finding a situation where Gervonta Tank Davis is fighting somebody that is a risk to him and isn't the same kind of cookie cutter stuff that he's been doing over his career, man. Like, it is very hard for me, to stomach the fact that Gervonta Davis, despite being from Baltimore and having a immense amount of his fan base be black American fight fans, and that really being where his support base comes from, the fact that he has not yet to date fought a black American fighter, at least not since he's been fighting with Floyd Mayweather Jr. Earlier in his career, he was with somebody else before he signed with Floyd, so there may have been somebody back then, but not at any point in time has he done that, or does it sound like he's interested in doing that since he's hit his stride and become one of the biggest stars in boxing, because he most certainly is. So Gary Russell Jr., who is somebody that I think is a perfect fight for Gervonta Davis to take. He's saying, look, he wants to fight Gervonta, but he's stuck in the middle of Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Gervonta Davis bamboozling boxing fans by putting on a bunch of I wouldn't say charade fights, because these are legitimate fighters that are out there, but not fights that really bring any risk to the table, and definitely not anything where it's like a really hometown feel out east where he's from. So I'm with Gary Russell on this, and I've said in other videos that I personally believe the reason that it doesn't happen is because Floyd Mayweather Jr. has a system in place for Gervonta Davis, and he's going to pretty much carry that system through all the way to the end of his career. And I don't believe that if Gervonta Davis fights a black American fighter in the next 5 years, I will be absolutely shocked. Because Floyd is somebody that is very systematic and doesn't seem like, when he finds something that works, he believes in making and having that thing work. So, like, even inside the ring or outside the ring. Inside the ring, Floyd Mayweather Jr. was somebody that would say, hey, look, man, he knew full well that he was not getting paid for knockouts. He was getting paid to win the fight. So if he had to stink out the gym to win the fight, and he very rarely did it, but if he had to do that, he would do that. He's not going to engage and necessarily try to go beyond what he has to do, other than to make sure that he secures that win, right? So, and he's not there necessarily to entertain the fans with a bunch of excitements and go rock 'em, sock 'em, and robots, but just went very, very systematically through the fighters that he fought. Once he became, a big star, he was very systematic about the types of fighters that he fought, right? So with Gervonta Davis, that's what he's doing. That's what he's doing with Gervonta Davis, and that's what Gary Russell Jr. is referring to as bamboozling the fans, right? Where you put him up there and I don't know how many knockouts he has. I think all but a couple fights, which were early in his career, and maybe 4-round fights, have been knockouts. But definitely since Pedraza to now, everything has been a knockout. Everything has been everything has been, an exciting knockout, a dominating performance for Gervonta Davis. But that is because he's been, one of the reasons it contributes towards that is because he's fighting pretty much the same crash test dummy every time he goes there. It's a type of fighter that Gervonta Davis is going to beat. They're guys that really do not have tremendous hand speed. They don't have tremendous foot speed. They're a come forward fighter. There's, straight up and down, no straight up and, like Floyd Mayweather said, straight up and down, no special effects, right? And it's not guys like, Floyd Mayweather Jr. faced early in his career, because he'll tell you that the toughest fight that he's ever had, or the toughest fighter he ever had, was against a guy named Emmanuel Augustus. And Emmanuel Augustus was somebody that, I remember from ESPN, a lot of old school fight fans really do remember as being a terrific fighter with a lot of talent that would throw fights and, all kind of stuff, right? The Drunken Master was hilarious to watch. But when he got in there with Floyd Mayweather Jr., he was fighting Floyd Mayweather Jr. dead serious to win. It caused Floyd Mayweather Jr. problems, man, because he wasn't one of those fighters that were just straight up and down, no special effects. But Gervonta, and I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is trying to steer Gervonta Davis free of those type of things, right? So, like, I did a video before about him fighting Chris Colbert, right? Chris Colbert is another fighter that's right around his weight class where it was a possible fight that he could make. And you can't tell me, but a lot of boxing fans will come, and I know I'll get this in the comment section, and it's honestly something I get kind of tired of, where they'll say, well, look, it's about the money, right? And Floyd's trying to get his money. Why are you hating on him trying to get his money? You can't tell me that Floyd Mayweather and Gervonta Davis can't get their money fighting Gary Russell Jr. Gary Russell Jr. is a very, very well-known fighter. People have, knocks on him for not fighting a lot, but you can't tell me you don't know who he is. And he's somebody that is from D.C. and Gervonta Davis is from Baltimore. That is their rivalry cities. There's a perfect opportunity for those guys to fight. So I just don't want to hear that that's the reason that he doesn't want to do it. What I believe is that they're trying to get Gervonta Davis and build him up to be an undefeated fighter, and making sure that he keeps his O so that they can make big fights and not the best fights. That's what Leonard Ellerbe had said, when he says, what are you trying to do with Tank? He's like, look, we at Mayweather Promotions are trying to make the biggest fights that we can make. And I think that making the biggest fights are the biggest fights that Gervonta Davis can win, and not necessarily the biggest monetary fights at that time. Otherwise, Gervonta Davis would be pushing hard for Gervonta Davis to fight Teofimo Lopez, or somebody like Gary Russell Jr., because I think Gary Russell Jr. is a really big fight. I'd be extremely excited for that. But most likely, you know how it goes, we're not going to get it, because that's how boxing goes these days. We can talk about these fights and hope that they're happening, but at the end of the day, you got to get the promoters to agree with one another. And even though Gary Russell Jr. and Gervonta Davis is an in-house fight, it seems like they don't want to come to agreement to fight with one another. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.